Okay. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Josh.
Welcome to the Explorer Poet podcast.
I'm so excited to meet you, to see you, and to
Yeah.
talk,
Yeah.
talk.
I actually felt like it was kind of a neat synchronicity because I followed you on social media because I had become familiar or aware of your work. And I use social media to find people who are similar and want to talk. And then you actually messaged me just saying that you would listen to the podcast. And so I thought, oh, what a great opportunity to connect.
Yay. Yeah, I have really enjoyed seeing who you're interviewing, and I did think we were on the same path, the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
passions.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this quote that I really like, and I tell myself all the time, and I can't remember who said it. I should look it up again. But basically, the idea is that if you're earnestly about your work, if you're earnestly on your path, then other people who are on similar paths will find you. And it seems like that's what happens. Is there's something going on where people of like minds want to connect and have conversations that are a little bit deeper than surface level stuff.
It's a perfect quote for me. I blogged this morning about Jung and going back to Catholic Mass. And I'm really kind of terrified to bring those worlds together, but that's part of my own split.
Oh, interesting.
And I did tell myself just this morning that how can I expect to find people who are interested in this if I don't put it out there? And so, yeah, I took that little brave step this morning.
Okay. Catholic Mass you attended?
So I was a Catholic, a charismatic Catholic when I was young, and it was a very trippy, amazing, dysfunctional time in my life. And the religious impulse is very strong in me and always has been, which is why I love Jung. But I left the church because it messed me up, or I was messed up. I connected to the mess up. And I think I found that in your history too. Yeah. A lot of people I'm meeting, and I think people interested in Jung are maybe those people who the religious impulse is still strong, but the old church stuff doesn't work. Anyway, I synchronistically got pulled back into an amazing church. And I'm so hungry for community.
Yeah.
That I've been trying to go, but it's this constant recalibrating and also, reinterpreting what they're saying and getting through my terror that I would fall into those bad dysfunctional patterns again.
Yeah, like they could bring up some old triggers or some old experiences.
Right.
Yeah.
Or the old good girl Laura could try to emerge again.
Yes.
But you know what? It's been 40 years. I've been 40 years in the desert. When I tell people that, they get all trippy because of that. That's a number in the Bible and that means something symbolically. It has been 40 years for me. And I think God, spirit, universe, whatever we call it, I was forced to stay away long enough to build up my reserves. And now if I go back, as I go back, I'm afraid I'm charged with a task, which is to bring the boon. I don't really want to.
Yeah, I
really don't want to.
Everything you're saying makes sense to me. You grow up in a system. Well, I too grew up in a way, and I think even now I have this desire for a religion, or I want to be converted to something that gives me meaning in life and explains the absurdity of life in a way that I can accept. But I grew up in a religion that was extremely literal. And, when I compare the Catholic Church to the Mormon Church, which is what I grew up in, very different experiences, because when I look at the Catholic Church, there's so much symbology and imagery right in your face. Everything is about it's almost like everything in the Catholic Church is about having an immediate experience, but then you go away and you go live your life. And then when you come back to church, you get to have that ritual, that experience again. But for me, growing up in the Mormon Church, if you've ever been in an LDS church building, there is very little imagery. It's very plain, there's everything it's almost built in like a cheap way, so that it's like this idea of modesty, but really what it is it screams of literalism, that this church doesn't represent something. Your life is this experience where every day you're supposed to be this person. And so you don't get that. There are moments in an LDS experience or a Mormon experience where there might be some connection to symbology or imagery, but it's so stripped down and bare because they want it to be so literal that at least that's how I interpret it. And so there's a part of me, even somebody who's never been Catholic, never attended Catholic Mass. I've been to a couple of quinceañeras and some child baptisms, and that's about it. But just being in a Catholic church, it's like walking into a place that's supposed to be different, whereas an LDS church is supposed to just be like, being at home.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I know I started reading about Jung and Joseph Campbell and their thoughts on the Catholic Mass, and it gave me courage that there is enough there to make going there make sense. Because I can pray at home, and I do. That religious impulse it's just so strong in me. But the monotheistic emphasis on one God, I think it reinforces the ego.
Right.
Or this is my feeling anyway, and that it's very easy to be egotistical, or that's the wrong word, to be ego focused or to lose sight of the higher self when you're in a monotheistic faith, I'm afraid, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I think about this all the time. And in fact, I just wrote something that I'm going to put out pretty soon. It's like a short 100-page thing that I'm going to put on my website, like a PDF that's downloadable. But I talk about that in there, where in my head, the way that I think about it is when we had these pantheons of gods, we had all these different gods. None of them were perfect. They all had flaws. So they all had a light side and a dark side. They all had a light side and a shadow. And then with the emergence of monotheism, what happens is the God, he took all of these other gods' light sides and then relegated the shadow to something he calls Satan. And so in religion, what we do because Catholic Church, I was talking about the symbology and Mormons being very literal, but the Catholic Church is also a literal church. They literally believe that this God is there. And so when you practice something in a literal way, what you're trying to do is actually emulate the God. You're trying to mimic or imitate what the God does, because that's how you draw closer to that God. That's how you show reverence to that God. And what you're talking about, this God who's all about his ego, I almost think of it as like this narcissistic God who he took all the good qualities and got rid of all the negative qualities, or what he considers negative. And so as people try to emulate that God, for one, it's been really beneficial in the West because we've become individuals. We've actually started to become individuals. And especially through somebody like Carl Jung, we can find this process of individuation. But the shadow side of that is that we don't see our shadow. We relegate that to other people, or to the world, or Satan, or whoever it is. And so in trying to mimic this monotheistic God, we all become narcissists.
I totally agree. And we lose the sense of all the inner parts of ourselves, all the pantheon within. And it is just this one strong ego. Have you watched the series, The Boys?
No.
The mythological series, The Boys?
No, I'm not familiar.
It's on Amazon, and it's about superheroes. And it's such a brilliant, I think, mythic description of our current inflated selves. Yeah. Because we have the power of gods now, and technology has given us so much power. Yeah. So we live in a constant state of inflation, and Edward Edinger's work really is important to me to remind me that the ego has to have the right relationship to the self. Otherwise, it all gets screwed up.
Yeah. Well, now we're talking about the ego discovering the right relationship to self. I think is the evolution from the monotheistic God focus in our culture to the romance culture, the romance focus in our culture, where that ego is trying to turn back to the inner self and balance itself out. That's another topic, but I also want to say that what you said about this story about heroes, I think I'm not a big Marvel superhero movie person. I think that actually Hollywood has it's lost a lot of its luster because it only produces these giant monomyths. But I think that's also an expression of this monotheistic problem that we have where, we have these gods, but in the Christian religion, which is the religion of the West, we also have this idea that there's somebody out there who's supposed to save us. There's this savior. And I see all these superhero movies as representations of the entire society just waiting for one person to come along and save us all.
Oh, man. Yeah. Yes, you are so right. And I think when I was in my 20s, a long time ago, Joseph Campbell's work, I think, was the kind of the opening up for me. I think I was into him before Jung, and, his idea that, well, wait a minute, we're all the hero in the story, and we have to take it on. And I'm not sure why more people in our culture don't realize how life-giving it is to do that. Yeah. It's the only way.
Yeah. And when I see something like what you're doing with your filmmaking, and what I see in it is it's art, it's creativity. And so for me, being somebody who's read both Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, I see you doing this individuation thing, right? And so in that way, you're becoming your own hero because you're not looking for somebody else to fix you or show you the way. You're just saying, oh, this is the thing that my inner self wants to express. And every time for me growing up, maybe it's that same religious instinct, or maybe it's just, I don't know. They say that the beginning of art is actually some kind of pain. And so maybe that's the thing we have in common. But all through my life growing up, anytime I watched a movie or a show, I read a book, it was always easy to relate to the hero. But when I look around in the world, I just wonder, when people are watching these movies, who is it that they're relating to?
I mean, my assumption is, and a lot of screenwriters really do buy into this idea that the hero's journey is what hooks us into a piece of fiction, and that we're living through that hero our own heroic journey. But you're saying maybe we're not taking the journey, we're just sort of living it vicariously through this fiction. It's remarkable to me, and you reference the filmmaking, how internally harrowing it is. And, people on the outside, and I think in our culture, especially now in the airbrushed era that we live in, people see something that looks successful, and I know I'm always trying to present myself in certain ways to look at, I won this award or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But, that I don't believe in my own publicity, but you have to do it. But it's what Joseph Campbell says about the struggle of the hero and the hero's journey. I experience that in a daily way. What the mystics talk about, the dark night and all of that, I'm experiencing that doing these little films. And the whole thing about where your treasure is, that's where the dragon is, that's where the darkness is. It sounds like a cliche, but it is the reason why such a vast majority of people in our culture don't pursue what they love. And I don't know, if we raised kids differently, would the hero's journey change? I don't know. I just know for myself, it's a really heroic struggle to follow what calls me.
Yeah. Like you really have to dig deep to go and slay that dragon to get at the treasure.
Yeah, I have lots of anxiety, and I've always struggled with anxiety and terror and feelings that I suck, and just all of it. Yeah. And I think that's another cultural thing. Like, are we kind of training ourselves and each other to not care so much? Like, I am just, and that's related, I'm going to be long-winded now. That's related to the inner child and how for me as an artist anyway, I think I've discovered, especially in the last year, that dynamism that Jung talks about as such a sacred part of us, that inner child is the dynamo. And she's filled with a lot of emotion and a lot of creativity. And if I let her do her thing, it helps the world. But it's hard in our world to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I really relate to the inner child story as well, or this idea that you carry that inner child with you forward. I think in psychology, they explain it fairly well, where, you come up against these experiences, these traumas, challenges, whatever it may be, and you're a child. And if you don't have an adult there to walk you through that challenge, to help you integrate it into yourself, then you actually, in that aspect of your life, you stop maturing. You just stay there. And what I found is that even as an adult, I still have that child with me inside of me. And there are moments where this thing comes at me and I don't know how to handle it like an adult. I only know how to handle it like a child. And so it's, that's that burden of overcoming. But that's why I think about all forms of growth, individuation, and healing. They're all the process of actually growing up, of maturation, because you're overcoming that childlike instinct, and you're integrating more of an adult form. In fact, when I was talking, I spoke a little bit negatively about Disney with the Marvel comics and things, but the last great Disney movie that I saw, and I don't think it got that much, critical acclaim or even was that well known, is this movie. You can watch it on their streaming service called Raya and the Last Dragon. And it's basically this idea of this land that's shaped like a dragon, and it has these different parts, and each part represents something like anger or intelligence. And so you can really quickly, if you're looking at it from a Jungian perspective, you can see how, this is the story of a child growing up, or like an individuation process, because all these different parts come to see each other as the enemy. And there's this hero who has to go through, she's the self, and she has to go through and save the kingdom. And as she goes along, she gets paired up with these different characters. And one of the characters is a child who runs around. It's like a baby who runs around with a band of monkeys. And that baby at first is like stealing from her to survive. But then that baby and the band of monkeys gets incorporated into the hero's journey with her. And there are other characters that, represent other aspects of ourselves. But as far as growing up, we have to, as far as healing or growing, we have to find that inner child and bring them along. We have to let them participate. And the movie does a great job of demonstrating that. But I think, yeah, there's this tendency to just, in our culture, to just let things be as they are, rather than trying to pull everything together, including that inner child.
Yeah. So I have two responses. One is, I definitely am tracking with this idea of the wounded part of the child. And there is just the archetype of the divine child, which I'm experiencing it in my life. So I teach sometimes, I do presentations, and I still suffer anxiety after many, many years. And I was realizing that child part of me, the creative part of me, wanted to lead the workshop.
Mm.
And I said, go for it. And it was really the best one I had ever done. So there is a vitality, a spark in us that never ages. And maybe that's what we're talking about. And I think our culture, so I think there's multiple, and I think Jung talked about all these different child parts too. And both are in play. And when you were talking about Disney and this movie, I think we're living in a time that 50 years from now or 100 years from now, this is not my feeling, that that all this Jungian work is that people are going to look back and go, oh, that's when a certain type of integration in the culture was starting to happen.
Right. Yeah.
Because, 100 years ago, what were the big cutting edge things that people were learning? And 100 years before that. So I feel very privileged, and it's what motivates me to make these films and spend my time and money, because I'm sort of a born again Jungian, and I want to help spread the gospel.
Yeah, I feel the same. Have you read the Red Book? Liber Novus?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, I haven't gotten into the Red Book like other people have. I certainly don't want to take it out of context, as some people
absolutely.
do.
I just think that you're right, though. There are a lot of people who look at the world today and they want to be negative about it. They want to be, they want to say, oh, we've got all this technology, this advancement, this science, and we're still stuck on religion. And the truth is that I think there are individuals in our society that are everybody's at different stages in this figuring it out kind of thing.
Yeah.
There are so many people out there who are still just completely locked into their religion of birth, who have never even heard of Carl Jung, who have never even heard of Joseph Campbell. And then there are all these people who have worked to produce analysis and scholarly literature on the history and the evolution of the story. And while I want the whole society to just jump forward to maturity in terms of the way we understand things and integrate things and therefore how we interact with each other. But at the same time, we're all just, humanity itself is this great entity that's growing up, and we're all just kind of along for the ride. We have to just be there for our portion of it.
Right. And do our portion of it. And more lately, I see how important it is for us to do our portion, even if it feels like, as I often feel, I'm just sort of screaming into the wind, and there's so much noise, and am I heard at all? And more I realize there is a process at work. I've recently gotten into Elia Delio, who's a Franciscan nun who integrates Jung and Teilhard de Chardin and really talks about process. And for me, she's articulating the myth that we're moving toward, which is that it's all process.
Yeah.
And we're part of the process. And if you're looking for static, that's, death is static.
Yeah. It's
well,
death
isn't even static, but I'm guessing.
Death. Yeah, that's a whole nother topic. Okay, so I actually do want to talk to you about your work.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. That was fun. We just jumped right in. So you create these stop motion films.
Yes.
And you've been doing it for just a few years now, right?
Yeah, it's probably 4 years. I'm guessing I started before the pandemic.
Okay.
Just before, yeah.
And there's a lot to go into this with your own individual process and what it means to you and how it's changed you and how it's affected you, but also just the themes of your stories, the fairy tales, and for those who have, a Jungian bent, this analytical view of things when they watch it, it's pretty interesting stuff. It's really fascinating. But just this week, as I was preparing to speak to you, I finished this book. Another guest on my show recommended it. It's called
Okay.
The Rings of Saturn. And
Yeah.
in this book, there's a character who is in England, and he's a farmer. And at some point in his 30s or 40s, he gets this inspiration to stop farming and spend all of his time building a miniature recreation of the Solomon Temple in his barn.
I can relate to this. Yes.
Yeah. So as soon as as I was preparing to speak with you, I was thinking of this story because in his experience, he went from doing something that was completely accepted in his society, working a job, providing for his family, to this thing that appeared, all of his friends and neighbors and family, they all kind of considered him a crazy person, until one day he had made it so far along and had been featured in so many articles and on the news that the prime minister rolled up, and wanted to see it. And then from that day forward, everybody felt like, oh, this guy is doing something important. And so I just want to share that example with you and just ask, what has your experience been like playing with dolls in your basement? What was the initial response to it?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a variety of things. I think for a long time, people might say, how's your hobby? And it would really irritate me because it never felt like a hobby. It actually has felt like a culmination of my life.
Yeah.
I was studying to be a therapist, but I instead went to study theater. And now I have my own little theater company doing things related to psychology. So the Maine Jung Center in the state of Maine approached me 3 years ago, or whatever it was. They were the first group. And the only reason they reached out was I was part of a fairy tale discussion group with them that was online. And I was meeting people. And so it was that thing that happens in our culture right now where either you're famous and people discover you, or it's a high touch kind of like, hello, I'm Laura, I make these movies.
Yeah.
And they were digging them. And that gave me a lot of comfort, because I think it just was at least a year, maybe 2 years, where I was just making them going, I don't know, this is a compulsion, but is anybody going to get it? Now, I love the work of Marie-Louise von Franz, and she writes on Jung and fairy tales, and she's the preeminent fairy tale scholar. And I kind of adopted her as a mother. And so I think your farmer turned builder, I'm assuming he did it from love.
Yeah.
Because
in the book, he's a religious person, so he says that he was inspired by the Holy Spirit.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess if the work comes from that or from love, then you're just gonna keep doing it, because that's kind of rare in our commodified. I think that's right. A word. Late capitalistic world that we live in. I mean, I meet people, especially filmmakers, but other people that say, well, how are you monetizing this? And, it's hard to give it away and give it away and give it away and give it away. But I think that's only because of the culture we live in, which is, what are you worth if you're not, what is this thing worth?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, because everybody who becomes an overnight success has been toiling away for 10 plus years in their basement, their garage, their bedroom. But there is this weird thing in our culture where every hobby anything you spend enough time at, people expect you to eventually monetize it in some way.
Yeah.
To make money at it, to prove. But there is this weird thing that happens where people who just focus on what they want to be doing, that focus on it for love, and they just do that thing and do that thing, eventually they become something. A lot of them do become financially successful, and a lot of them become something that's revered in society. And then the weird thing about the internet culture is that a lot of stuff does get given away for free.
Yeah.
A lot of it, at least it has to start that way.
Yeah.
And, with this podcast currently, it's not monetized. I'm just doing it because I really enjoy having these type of conversations. And I think a lot of people start out that way. They're just doing something that they feel this impulse for. For me, sometimes for whatever reason, I have to like choose not to do a lot of things because I have this mind that's like, I can see the end from the beginning in almost like any venture that I could go try to tackle. And so anytime I see somebody doing something and I think, oh, that looks like it could be fun, that looks like it could be interesting, or I could do that, I have this pull to go do it. And so I really have to restrict myself from, jumping into those waters. But there is this, circling back, there is this thing in our culture where, for today, at least, it probably hasn't always been this way since the internet kind of blew up, where you really do have to give it away. You give it away. It's like that. I don't know if you know the Red Hot Chili Peppers. They have that song "Give It Away Now."
Yeah.
And that's what your words reminded me of. But it's like, that kind of is the process these days. Is you give it away until you're doing something that enough people are interested in, and then if it gets monetized, it doesn't usually get monetized directly, but indirectly.
Right. Yeah. My prayer has been that the work will be useful. And I hope that's the case. I hope that's the case. And there's a lot of people. So while I'm going to this church now and I try to talk about my work or Jung, and there's such a gap between people who don't know anything and people who've been studying it for many, many years. And Jung is not an easy, and fairy tales and dream work and all of these things, they're not quick.
Yeah.
I have spent decades studying this stuff and I'm not an analyst. So I'm self-taught, and there's proof in life that this stuff works. And I have these experiences that are powerful and wonderful. But yeah, they were 20 years in the making.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or more. So it's hard. And I guess I'm just hoping that, and this is why I built this new website that's making me crazy, is if you build it, they will come, and my responsibility is to build it. And if people find it great, I hope they do.
Yeah. And it's likewise, if you accept the idea of the collective unconscious or the astral light or the great agent, or even if you call it the light of Christ, whatever you want to call it, if you accept that there's this thing happening, this thing that connects us all, and that we're all part of this, the evolution of this story. And you were saying we all have to do our part. That's your part. You put it out there. You just add. And as long as you're adding, and as long as you are becoming as conscious as you can become in your time, then you're adding to the growth of the whole in some way.
That has been the big shift for me, even just in this last month, because I felt called to write a feature screenplay, which is like a Godzilla that's eating up all of my time, but I still feel committed to the short films. And now I'm going to this church and I feel like I need to be writing essays about that. And they all feel like callings.
Yeah.
And
this is what I was describing. Yeah. You just feel pulled into all these things.
Yes. And I have a family and I have a garden, and all I can do is what I can do.
Yeah.
And that's been amazing to go, all right, I'll do what I can. That's all I can do.
Yeah. Tend your garden. There's this quote that I have, and I found it out. So you gave a presentation at the Mythologium 2023. Am I saying that? Mythologium?
Yes, that's it.
And I think it's behind a paywall, so I didn't actually get to see your video. I've seen, there's another lady I've had on the podcast who's become one of my friends, is Jeannie Raffa. And I got to see her video because she posted it on YouTube, but I haven't seen your presentation.
Oh, okay.
But on the website where you give your presentation, it had a quote from Mary Louise von Franz, and it says, "Fairy tales are the simplest and purest expressions of the collective unconscious, and thus offer the clearest understanding of the basic patterns of the human psyche. And
Yeah.
so I do want to jump into, we've talked already a little bit about stories, myths, fairy tales, but I want to jump into fairy tales and, why fairy tales for you? Why do they jump out to you? And in this process, this 20-year process of coming to understand and analyzing for you, why is it that fairy tales above, say, scriptural mythology or ancient mythology or even modern stories? Why fairy tales? And in a way, I know that they're all kind of the same thing, but they're categorized differently.
Yeah, and it all came together. So von Franz, Jung was too hard for me. So I just read everything von Franz wrote, and it was really, I still only understood about half, but it was healing. I knew it was healing me regardless. And she's all about the fairy tale. So when I started stop motion, and I only started stop motion to learn how to use my camera. So I bought a camera. I was going to kind of look into filmmaking. I thought I'll try some stop motion to learn the camera. And I thought fairy tales were the right length. And then the dolls were kind of perfect for the fairy tale. And the fairy tales, I just trusted that there was wisdom in them. Like they are centuries old or millennia old, and that they were going to have this wisdom in the bones of them, and that I could work on the stop motion, and the story was sort of already going to be kind of golden for me. So that's why I settled on fairy tales, and it just felt like a perfect kind of marriage of these parts, the dolls and the stop motion and the length and the story. And then I started sharing them with a small group of women, and I started sharing them at conferences because I had this idea, but I hadn't really tried it out with other people other than myself. And they work like a dream works, or if you're in a fairy tale discussion group, but the films work on another level. And I loved that they were short, so that, we can discuss a feature film, but that gets really kind of hard, right?
Yeah.
We're swimming in the ocean. But if you take a 3-minute film, or a 7-minute film or whatever, I've worked with groups of women for 90 minutes on that. I mean, we can go deep into our own inner life and find, where is that energy? Where is that symbol living in me right now? It's really wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. So many thoughts. The first one is just what you said about Mary Louise von Franz, about her being more accessible for you. And I think I've heard that before. There's another lady I had on my podcast, Bea Gonzalez, who's an author, and
I know Bea.
She's all about Jungian stuff as well.
Yeah.
And she said the same thing. She said that Jung might be too distant for some people, but von Franz does a good job of taking what he has and distilling it into something that's a little more digestible. But then also the fairy, I totally understand what you're saying about the length, the difficulty of the fairy tales. There's something about fairy tales as well, where if you were to take, for example, the Bible and you wanted to put out Bible stories, there's immediately this connotation about Bible stories. Either you believe them as literal or you completely dismiss them as lies. There doesn't seem to be, in our culture, there doesn't seem to be this middle ground, which sounds like what you're trying to figure out going back to Catholic Mass is, where's this middle ground? Where's the truth in it that doesn't have to be literal? But with fairy tales, for whatever reason, maybe because we don't see them as something that's supposed to be a true story or something that's supposed to have actually happened, there's this distance from them emotionally that allows us to think about them. We already think about fairy tales in a metaphorical way, or as analogies or something. And And so I can see how just that alone makes them much more easy to share with other people in a way where if you were sharing religious stories, again, it may come across as if you're trying to preach or convert people. But in sharing fairy tales, that's what the mainstream does. That's what Disney does, is they just share fairy tales.
Yeah. So a bunch of thoughts from that. From what I'm understanding, we think about fairy tales as living alongside religious myths and stories, and they may be a kind of a compensation for them. And so they have some of maybe the darkness that some of these other religious stories maybe don't have. And so they maybe have a more whole vision of the psyche. They express a whole vision of the psyche. They're gruesome. But that reminds me of what I wrote this morning, which was the reading at the Mass, which was the parable of the wedding, where the king kills all these people who won't come to the wedding feast. And then the king throws out the guy who won't wear the wedding garment into the gnashing of teeth. He's like a really brutal guy. And the priest, who's a progressive guy, said, I don't like this story. And he kind of wouldn't even talk about it. And I was thinking, wait a minute, from living with fairy tales for all these years, I see the dimension of it that is speaking to my condition. It's not about some mean old guy who throws people out of a wedding banquet. It's about how I don't accept the abundance in my life. I bind my own hands and feet.
Right.
I'm doing it to myself. So I think this symbolic language is a language that people like us are studying because it's the language the unconscious speaks. And it's another language. It's really crazy to me.
It's a language that's even older than words, especially the written word. Yeah, much older.
Yeah. And by and large, we don't know how to speak it anymore. And I think, back in the day when the Mass was in Latin and people were looking at the stained glass and watching the constellations at night, they were more in the mythic world all the time. And they understood more than we do, I think, what happens in the psyche.
Yeah. But that's a good example, I think, of what I was saying too, where this priest who was reading the story, he saw it, he's reading it from the Bible, and so he's thinking, okay, this actually happened. Right. And so he's like, I don't like this. I don't like this behavior. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to emulate it. But that's just because he's not thinking of it like you're saying, where you have to look at every story as if, not as if it's literally true, but as if it happens and it occurs inside of you.
Exactly.
And that requires a big leap, because people have to then say, okay, well, what do these different characters represent inside of me? Exactly. And what am I doing that's akin to this behavior of, casting people out or killing people because they didn't come to this wedding, or because they wore the wrong clothing, they appeared in the wrong persona to this wedding. It's not an easy thing for people to do, because that's the challenging thing with the Bible, is that it's true. Every story is true. Every story is true because every story at some level comes up from the unconscious.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it literally happened. It may just mean that it's it's symbolic representation of what we experience in our psyche. And I think people really struggle with that.
I struggle with it. I mean, this story to me, the one that I'm talking about, for me, it ultimately means our life is like being invited to a banquet. And what would it mean if we really accepted that? What would it mean if we gave up late stage capitalism and shared everything and lived in a crazy way? I mean, it's crazy, right? It's crazy. I got mine, you get yours. And so the ego just, anyway, I keep going toward this one thing, and I do want to talk about my films. It's interesting.
No, that's okay. Like I said, let's let the conversation go where it goes.
Yeah.
Have you tackled the ego have you felt like you've tackled the idea of the ego directly in your films?
Yeah, maybe. So the first thing that comes up from that question is I had a film that was really fun for me that I explored the inner critic, which is, something I can very much grapple with in my life. And so that was a really fun film to one doll is that inner critic. But then what happened in that film was it's like the inner critic has his own journey. And so then I was tripping on the idea that our inner parts have their own lives.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The inner critic has a light side and a shadow side, right?
Yeah.
Because
he had
you've
his
got to
own
be
journey.
critical in some way. You have to be able to judge yourself and say, am I actually living up to what I want to be living up to?
Yeah.
But you can't do it to such a degree that it's detrimental to your external life.
Right. And that was based off of a fairy tale too. In terms of ego, that's such a big, so like I did, the Percival legend from King Arthur. Mm-hmm. That was really one of my longest films, called Percy Grows Up. And on a level that's about a male psyche and what it means to be a man today. So I guess there's ego. I mean, yeah, I'm sure if we went through all of the films, there's a place for this idea of the ego. And I think I'm thinking in terms of fairy tales, and I was just reading again von Franz today, and the idea of the king in fairy tales, which is, recurrent, and the king being the dominant psychological reality of a person or of a culture. And the king has to be kept virile and healthy. Otherwise, king's got to go. Let the new come.
Yeah. So within our own selves, within myself, within yourself, there's a king, and every great king needs a great queen to keep him in check, to keep him viral. But I like the way you said whether it's us as individuals or as the culture, because I always think about that. This analysis that we do, that we've been talking about for our individual selves, can just as easily be overlaid on a cultural analysis, where there is an ego and a shadow and a persona, an anima animus taking place on a broader scale within our individual society. Like, I think about it as, going all the way from the individual to the family to the community. In America, it would be like our cities, our states, and then the entire nation. But even from that point up, the nation becomes some character in the global psyche as well. That
very true.
That whole, yeah. And I guess that kings or the kingly figure is an important figure from top to bottom.
Yeah, and I think in fairy tales, it has represented a certain stability that is either good or stifling bad. And Campbell talks about this, just a lot of rituals involving the king.
Yeah. Have you read Campbell's, have you read his Masks of God series?
His Massive God series?
Yeah, he has a series of books called The Masks of God.
Oh, The Masks of God. Got it.
Yeah.
I think I might have read some of it.
Okay. Well, it just, this idea that you're talking about of the ritual with involving kings, there's a lot. And a lot of them actually include killing the king.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing how the overlay of this historical event that happened, which represents something that's happening in the psyche. And I think, if somebody's listening to this and they don't have a background in Jung, it sounds very fantastical, until you're in a workshop and somebody does an active imagination and the king comes up, and if you've been in this situation as I have, and this drama therapeutic ritual happens in a workshop, and then the person is changed, like that active imagination that taps into these archetypal realities it's real, and it's real stuff that really happens. And the problem with Jung and a lot of what I'm attracted to is it's all experiential. If you haven't had the experience, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. What do you think holds people back from having the experience in their life, even without having read Jung? Because I think you're right. If you experience what he's talking about, then as you read Jung, it seems so familiar.
Yes.
But what holds people back from having that experience?
I don't know. I mean, my first thought is this desire to be, quote, normal, and normal means there's kind of no inner life.
Yeah.
I mean, we're sort of sadly, back to the child thing where imagination is our most important quality. And yet it's drilled out of us somehow and labeled as, bad.
Yeah. I think about it. I think about it like you were saying, that we have this childlike impulse within us throughout our whole lives. Mm-hmm. And when I look at the world, all I see is just games everywhere. Everything's a game. It's just all these things that we created to do. Mm. And that's a game. Those are all games. So every career path is a game. Every job is a game. Every activity that we do is a game. Our romantic relationships are games. It's like we get sucked into them because, we think that they're the adult thing to do. But in truth, at some point in history, they didn't exist. Somebody had to create them. And so people with this impulse to create, it's as if they're creating new games. And everybody who doesn't want to create new games, they just play games that everybody else is playing. So if there's not a lot of people out there who are creating fairy tale stop motion films in their basement, that's a game that you invented for yourself. And as you go about, as you go around, or as you go about creating these films, then there are people who are looking at you and going, like me, for example, I look at you and I go, I'm really interested in this game you're playing. I think it's really neat. I think it's cool. I think you're creating something special. But, there are people who maybe can't get past that first year or two of loneliness or solitude, or, this thing about I'm playing a game by myself. What do other people think about that?
Yeah, for sure. And I just have to say, it's interesting when the unconscious sort of takes the lead, because it was maybe a year in before I realized that I was playing with dolls, and that was inner child work. that the use of the dolls, and later people would say to me, it puts them in a child place to be watching dolls. But that wasn't like some big plan that I had in my head. Yeah. I think your idea about games is so, it's powerful. I don't know if you've done a lot around game theory, but I think about the stock market as being some big, people who get to play that game. The unfortunate piece is that they're playing the game and it might be fun for them, but sort of screws everybody else up. But I
see all these things as games. The stock market, our religions are games. The organized piece of their religion, the institutionalization of it, is a game. And our governments are games. Our borders don't actually exist in nature. They only exist because we all agree they exist, like kids playing games. But the interesting thing about kids playing games is that they call it play, but seldom do they say let's create a new game. They just say, hey, let's create this situation and see what comes of it. And I don't know, it's fascinating to watch, and then to watch the way that adults are so scared of doing the same thing.
Right, because all the problems that we face in our culture, if we approach them creatively instead of getting locked into structures that maybe started as games, but now are kind of prisons.
Yeah. Talk to me about I'm sure that while you're doing it, there's this, like you're saying in your head, you're not actively thinking about, oh, I'm playing with dolls or I'm doing, inner child work, but there's got to be a sense that you are doing something for you. And
Oh
there's got
yeah.
to be a little bit of, I'm sure there's a little bit of, you've experienced a little bit of loneliness, but the light side of loneliness is solitude, where you just get to be by yourself doing what you freaking want to do finally. So what's that like for you? Or do you think about loneliness and solitude, or either one of them?
So great question. My personality is I'm kind of a mystic hermit. So
Yeah, I relate.
during during the pandemic, I'm sorry, it was terrific for people. I understand that. And for me, the fact that I got to get off of the treadmills I had been on for work and just play in my basement and make these films, it's such an amazing joy. And I also didn't have to justify anything because everything was shut down.
Yeah.
So I could just be. So yeah, I never get enough kind of solitude in my life. I'm always craving more. So that part of it hasn't been the issue. In fact, I mean, I have some shame to share that, having my own little kingdom in my basement with these dolls, controlling everything, unfortunately it fits me, as opposed to working with live actors and having to deal with all the logistics of live action. Being alone has fit me.
Yeah.
And I feel bad because there is a control freak part of that too. That, I'm
you want to play
I'm the master.
Game.
I'm the god. Yeah.
Yeah. You want the game to go the way that you want it to go.
Yeah.
Other people just get in the way.
Right.
Yeah, I know how that is. I mean, I'm working as I'm trying to write some things as well. And so being a writer is the same way. You just get to sit with yourself and there's nobody else there and you get to choose how it all goes. And maybe, it may be, we were talking about why do some people not pursue that path? Why do some people not go to slay the dragon? Why do some people only play games that other people play? And I really think for a lot of people, there's a part of it that they don't understand the difference between loneliness and solitude. And that may be, again, with that artistic impulse, it may speak to some kind of injury or something that some kind of pain that happened early enough where you decided you'd rather play your own game anyways. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of people in society who they can't be by themselves. And for me, I'm like you, I can't get enough of just being by myself. I love people. I love doing this, but there's something about just being able to have hours at a time where nobody's interrupting me. If I'm even if I'm reading or just going for a walk, or if I'm working, especially, it's like a gift to really appreciate solitude.
Yeah, and that mystic, I've realized for me that is part of it. I've made my peace with the fact that most people I know don't understand that, or me. Yeah.
Well, I'm somebody who understands it, and so here I am. We can have these type of conversations anytime you want.
Yeah, man.
I'm looking at the clock, and we're right at an hour right now.
Oh my God.
Went by quick, huh?
Yeah.
I want to share a couple of quotes. One of them is from you, and you shared it in one of your speeches, and it may have been the same mythologium speech, but I saw this on either your website or somebody else's website, but you simply said, we need fairy tales and myths because we need to be reminded that we're part of a bigger story. And that really relates to, that really like hits me, because I think that's what that religious impulse is to find something to which we can be a smaller part instead of us being the biggest part of that thing. And then there's this other quote which kind of, for me, it relates to the fairy tales, but it also relates to you, doing you being you, working on the thing that you want to work on, and finding a way to be creative in that way, to have a fun, playful time, a childlike time. And this is by Johann Huizinga. And he says, in the wild imaginings of mythology, a fanciful spirit is playing on the borderline between jest and earnest.
I love that.
And I think that what you're doing is fantastic. When you come on here, the moment you appeared on the screen, you had this energy that showed me the fanciful spirit that's within you. And I think that in watching your videos, there's a lot of jest going on. There is a lot of humor in it, and it's fun. But I can also see the earnestness of it, and how you see the importance of sharing what you can share with the collective, whether that be through your films or writing blogs on the Catholic Mass. And I think that what you're doing is great. And so I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. I want to add one thing, as I imagine, if I hope that any listener goes to watch some of my films, and I have it somewhere on my website. I'll have to find it, but I think one of the characters, I made an introduction to my films, and one of the characters says, don't worry if you don't understand things, just feel it. And I think in this literal culture, the ability to stay with not understanding something is powerful. We don't understand I don't understand my dreams. Half the time, me and the women I meet with, we don't understand the fairy tale. But sitting with that lack of understanding, which the ego hates, I think is an important act that von Franz tells me the unconscious is really happy with and will reward us with.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I also think that there's something about children where they can't sit with ambiguity. They need an answer for everything. And part of the growing up and maturation process is getting to a point where you're okay with ambiguity.
Okay.
Because as an adult, you just have to accept the absurdity of everything.
Yeah.
And you can't possibly have an answer for everything.
Cool.
So
that's a great ending.
Well, Laura, this was fantastic. Before we close up, why don't you share your new website and social media, YouTube, that kind of thing, or wherever you are, so that people can look you up?
PsycheCinema.com is my new website that I am working on. It's not been easy, but all my films are there now. So you don't have to even go to YouTube. So Psyche, Psyches, Psyche's cinema.com. And everything you should be able to find through that.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks again, Laura. I appreciate it. This was fun.
Thank you, Josh.
Okay. Bye, everybody.